Live from Maryland Public Television, this is Direct Connection with Jeff Salkin.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in for Direct Connection. Later in the program, your local newspaper is shrinking if it isn't closing. We will talk to two former Examiner reporters who are in search of a new audience online. That is coming up. First tonight, both sides of the death penalty debate are searching for votes on the eve of a showdown in the Maryland State Senate. Joining us live from Annapolis now is Liam Farrell, state government reporter for the Annapolis Capitol. Liam, thanks for being with us.
Good to be here, Jeff.
So Friday, I guess the committee vote on this was a tie, which ordinarily is the end of the matter in the state legislature. Why is this different?
Well, typically, yes, it is. When a 5-5 vote is done in a committee, that typically means the end. But Senate President Miller has said that this year, in deference to the governor and supporters of the repeal, that he is actually going to invoke a rare procedural move or allow somebody to invoke a rare procedural move, which would replace their unfavorable opinion with an intact repeal bill. Now, that maneuver takes a majority of the Senate, and it's questionable at this point whether they actually have the votes to do that, let alone get a repeal passed somewhere down the line.
So I did see a press release from the governor's office that at 9:40 tomorrow morning, 20 minutes before the Senate convenes, they're having an event with some former state officials who oppose the death penalty. Does that mean that there's last-minute arm twisting going on, or does that mean it's more of a publicity battle?
Well, the governor is making a last-minute push. He's been meeting with lawmakers last week, and he's apparently been calling some who are wavering. This afternoon at a press conference, he actually read part of a speech that Robert Kennedy gave in Cleveland the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and the governor got pretty emotional during this, talking about violence, forgetting violence, and being beneath our society to kill. The problem is a lot of these moral arguments aren't resonating with some of the legislators he's trying to turn. For example, Senator Brian Simon-Ayer, who was a potential swing vote, had a meeting with the governor last week. But when the governor brought up moral concerns, Simon-Ayer, who's a Republican, said it just didn't mesh with the state's stance on abortion. So whether the moral arguments or the statistical ones that are made in the Death Penalty Commission's report this summer are more, or excuse me, this winter, are more substantive to people on the fence is still in the air at this point.
So the state of Maryland obviously has a constitutionally strong governor's office, and normally if they're lobbying some routine bill, the governor has some pretty good leverage in terms of twisting arms and getting votes. You're saying that on this sort of moral debate, not so much.
Well, it's difficult because you can kind of divide, despite the Democratic majority throughout Maryland's government, you can kind of divide their decisions in social and fiscal policy. With fiscal policy, the governor and the leadership is more easily able to get legislators to go their way. But in something like this with the death penalty, Speaker Mike Bush and Senate President Mike Miller typically don't even bother lobbying delegates and senators because their minds have been made up on the issue for so long. So it's much harder, and the governor is having to do a lot of the lifting on his own in this case. And when people come in and with their moral ground chosen for who knows 10, 15, 20, 30 years, it's going to take a lot to get them to shift.
Let me remind our viewers, if you have a question about what's happening in Annapolis tomorrow, you can give us a call at the number on the screen or email us by visiting our website at mpt.org. Liam, have the arguments changed at all? We know there was as you mentioned, there was another commission report delivered over the interim. Has anything evolved in this debate?
Well, it's really reminiscent of what happened 2 years ago in 2007. The arguments really haven't shifted, although the governor, like I said before, is emphasizing more of the moral implications of it over some of the statistical ones, although the Death Penalty Commission, in its report released in December, did indicate how people in Baltimore County are much more likely to get a death sentence than if they're in Baltimore City. And there's the whole debate over whether the costs are, more expensive for for someone sentenced to death rather than life in prison. But the problem is, inevitably, all of these legislators seem to come back to some sort of moral quandary, whether that be an imperfect system that could put somebody to death who is innocent, or whether somebody given a life sentence will just kill again and again in prison. One senator, Norman Stone of Baltimore County, expressed the fear that someone with a life sentence could be the designated killer in prison and just have no fear of retribution from then on. So you can make all of the cases you want to in terms of statistics. I mean, but the ACLU and many other organizations have been doing that for decades. A lot of times with these legislators, it comes down to their own moral code. And the Senate is somewhat socially conservative. You wouldn't necessarily guess that by their fiscal record, necessarily because of the special session and the tax votes and so on. But there are a lot of Democrats who are on the side of the pro-life movement. There are Democrats who are on the side of supporting capital punishment. So you can't be as broad brush as you can in other issues.
What happens if this maneuver fails and the death penalty remains on the books? We don't actually have a death penalty at the moment or the means to carry one out because of this Court of Appeals order. From, I think, 2 years ago, is there any indication that the process would pick up speed, or would it stay on the shelf?
Well, since the death penalty, since all the court business in the Court of Appeals, the governor has kind of put the brakes on issuing new protocols, regulations. The two sides of that were, one, he's waiting for the Supreme Court to go through some of the issues on lethal injection, and the other, he was kind of waiting to see how this repeal and then the commission, how that played out. But, I mean, if the repeal fails again, Republicans who have been pretty vocal in the past about the governor being derelict in his constitutional duties because he is not upholding the law as it is by establishing a death penalty that's on the books, you know, they may push again. It would be pretty hard if the repeal fails now to politically justify trying to do it again in the next session. My guess is that another repeal debate would have to wait until after the 2010 election if the Senate doesn't pass it this time.
Liam, before we go, I wanted to ask about the electricity issue. I guess at the beginning of the session, that wasn't really on too many people's radar screens for this 90-day session, but since everybody's gotten their gas and electric bill for at least part of the winter, it seems to be higher on the agenda, and the governor had a news conference on that today.
Yes, the governor unveiled a proposal that would allow some re-regulation in the future with new power plants. It would allow the Public Service Commission, which is in charge of issues such as energy in the state, the PSC would be able to determine when new energy generation is needed and could direct private companies to build them. The concern being that it is in the private monetary interest of shareholders in these companies not to build any more generation, because let's face it, you know, the costlier each kilowatt is, you know, that's furthering their goal. Why would you build something that would be less of a return for your own company? So the governor's hoping to do that. He doesn't want to go back in time and do full re-regulation, but he's hoping that using the state's muscle in the future will, you know, tamper down this politically volatile issue as people see nothing but higher bills.
All right, Liam Farrell of the Annapolis Capitol. Liam, thanks for making time for us tonight. We appreciate it.
No problem.
And still to come, the dramatic